The look of confusion on their faces when they saw me step out of the lead car was almost worth the 3 months of hell they'd put me through. "What's going on?" Mom called out, walking toward us with that familiar mix of authority and annoyance she'd perfected since marrying Rob. "Why are there police cars here?" I handed her the legal documents while the deputies flanked me on either side. "This is a formal eviction notice," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm. "You have been illegally occupying my house for the past 3 months, and you now have 48 hours to remove your belongings and vacate the property." Rob stepped forward, his face already turning red. "Your house? Are you insane? This is our family home. We've been living here for 2 years. "Actually," I said, pulling out the copy of my father's will and the property deed. "This house has been legally mine since I turned 18 2 months ago. You've been living here without the owner's permission." Mom's face went completely white as she stared at the documents in her hands. Rob's older son, Marcus, was recording everything on his phone from behind their car. They had no idea whose name was on the deed. To understand how I got to that moment, you need to know what happened after my dad died. He had a sudden heart attack when I was 16 years old, and in the space of one terrible night, my entire world collapsed. Dad had been my anchor, my support system, and the only person in my family who really understood me. When he was gone, I felt completely lost. Mom was devastated too, but she handled her grief by throwing herself into a new relationship faster than I thought was possible. She met Rob at a grief counseling group just 6 months after Dad's funeral, and they were married within 18 months. I tried to be supportive because I wanted Mom to be happy, but everything about our family dynamic changed overnight. Rob moved into our house with his 2 kids from his previous marriage, Marcus, who was 17, and Jessica, who was 15. Suddenly, our quiet 3-bedroom house felt cramped and chaotic. What made it worse was that Rob seemed to view me as a problem that needed to be managed, rather than a stepson he wanted to welcome into his family. Dad's death changed everything about our family. The integration problem started almost immediately. Since Rob's kids were used to having their own rooms, and our house only had 3 bedrooms, I was told I needed to share my space. Marcus moved into my room, and I was given a corner with a fold-out bed behind a makeshift curtain. Jessica got the guest room all to herself, because according to Rob, teenage girls need their privacy. Mom justified this arrangement by saying it was temporary, and that we all needed to make sacrifices to become a real family. But temporary turned into months then, over a year. Meanwhile, Marcus treated my half of the room like his personal storage space, and Jessica complained loudly. Whenever I used the main bathroom, because it disrupted her morning routine. The house that had been my safe haven with Dad became a place where I felt like I was constantly in the way. Every family dinner, every movie night, every weekend activity was planned around Rob's kids' preferences and schedules. When I tried to participate, I was either ignored or made to feel like an intruder who was disrupting their family bonding time. I became a guest in my own home, but the clearest sign of where I stood in the family hierarchy was how money was spent. Rob's kids got new clothes for every season, the latest phones, their own cars, when they turned 16, and expensive college prep courses. When I asked about getting help with my own college applications, I was told that I should get a part-time job to build character and learn responsibility. Jessica got a brand new laptop for her sophomore year. Marcus got professional tutoring for his ZA. When I mentioned that I was struggling with calculus, Mom suggested I ask my teacher for extra help during lunch. Rob's kids came first in everything. Everything came to a head during my senior year when Rob decided he'd had enough of me being part of the family. The conversation happened on a Thursday evening while I was doing homework at the kitchen table. Rob came home from work in a bad mood, saw me there, and launched into a complaint about how I never seemed to fit in with their family dynamic. "He's always hovering around making everyone uncomfortable," Rob told Mom while I was sitting right there. "My kids feel like they can't relax in their own home because there's this constant tension. Marcus told me he's tired of sharing his space with someone who doesn't want to be part of the family." I tried to defend myself, pointing out that I'd been nothing but respectful and had tried my best to adapt to all the changes they'd made to my living situation. But Rob cut me off. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "Everything is always about how hard this is for you, how much you've had to sacrifice. My kids have made sacrifices too, but they don't complain about it constantly." The argument escalated from there. Rob demanded that Mom choose between maintaining peace for his children or continuing to enable what he called my disruptive behavior. He said his kids deserved to feel comfortable and secure in their home environment, and that my presence was preventing that from happening. Rob said the house wasn't big enough for all of us. Mom stood there listening to Rob's ultimatum, and I could see her weighing her options. I honestly thought she'd stand up for me, at least try to find some kind of compromise or suggest family counseling. Instead, she looked at me with something that might have been regret and said the words that changed everything. "Maybe it would be best if you found somewhere else to live for a while, just until everyone can adjust better. You're 18 now, and maybe some independence would be good for you. You have 2 weeks to figure out your living arrangements." She started packing my belongings that same night. Rob's kids would finally have the space and peace they'd been demanding. The family could function the way Rob wanted it to, without any disruptions from the son who apparently didn't belong. She kicked me out of my own house. My dad's parents welcomed me with open arms when I showed up at their house with 2 duffel bags and a broken heart. Grandma took one look at my face and immediately started making up the guest room, while Grandpa helped me carry my things inside without asking a single question about why I wasn't living at home anymore. "You can stay here as long as you need," Grandma said, pulling me into one of her warm hugs that smelled like vanilla and lavender. "This will always be your home." Living with my grandparents was the first time in years that I felt genuinely welcomed somewhere. They included me in their daily routines, asked about my day with genuine interest, and treated me like a beloved family member instead of an unwanted houseguest who was disrupting everyone's peace. The guest room they gave me was larger than the corner space I'd been sharing with Marcus, and for the first time since Dad died, I had privacy and quiet to do my homework and college applications. But what struck me most was how differently they talked about my dad and the house compared to how Mom had been handling things. They would mention repairs Dad had made, improvements he'd planned, and decisions he'd made about the property, as if those things still mattered. They spoke about him as though his wishes and intentions were still relevant, not just memories to be set aside for more practical concerns. My grandparents knew something Mom didn't. Meanwhile, the family I'd left behind was thriving in ways that made it painfully clear how much happier they were without me. Within a week of my departure, Marcus had moved all his belongings into what had been our shared room and was posting Instagram stories about finally having his own space. Jessica had completely transformed my old corner into what she called her creative studio, complete with an art easel, a photography setup, and a full-length mirror for her TikTok videos. Rob was finally getting the family dynamic he'd always wanted. Peaceful dinners, where no one questioned his decisions. Weekend activities planned exclusively around his kids' interests, and no uncomfortable reminders of his wife's previous life. The house felt bigger, quieter, and more harmonious, without the constant tension that my presence had apparently been causing. The social media posts started almost immediately and were relentless. Mom began sharing photos of their happy family moments. Rob and his kids playing board games in the living room family movie nights, with everyone cuddled on the couch weekend trips to the beach where they all looked perfectly content. The captions were always about how grateful she was for her wonderful family and how blessed she felt to have such amazing kids who brought so much joy to her life. I wasn't in any of the photos, and after a few weeks you'd never know from Mom's social media that she'd ever had another child. The narrative had been completely rewritten. Rob's kids were now simply her children, and their family unit was perfect and complete without the disruptive presence that had been causing all their problems for the past 2 years. They were living their best life in my house. But as my 18th birthday approached, my grandparents started having conversations that made me pay closer attention. They would speak in low voices about legal documents and responsibilities, about things that needed to be taken care of when I became an adult. When I asked what they were talking about, Grandpa would just say that there were some matters regarding your father's estate that we'd need to discuss soon. A few days before my birthday, Grandma sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that my dad had left very specific instructions about what should happen when I turned 18. She handed me a business card for a lawyer who specialized in estate planning and wills. "Your father was very thorough about protecting your future," she said. Her voice filled with both sadness and pride. "He made sure you'd have options that your mother might not be aware of. I think it's time you learned about what he really left for you." The lawyer had some interesting news about Dad's will. The meeting with the lawyer changed everything I thought I knew about my family situation. Mr. Davidson was a quiet, methodical man who had been my father's attorney for over a decade, and he walked me through the will with the kind of careful attention to detail that made it clear this wasn't his first time dealing with complicated family dynamics. "Your father was very specific about what he wanted to happen to the house," Mr. Davidson explained, spreading the documents across his desk. "The property was left directly to you in a trust that was managed by your mother until you reached the age of 18. As of last week, when you turned 18, you became the sole legal owner of the property." The legal language was complex, but the reality was simple. Mom had never owned the house. She had been appointed as temporary guardian of the trust, with the responsibility to maintain the property until I came of age. Her guardianship had automatically ended on my 18th birthday, and she no longer had any legal authority over the house or any right to live there without my permission. Dad left the house to me, not Mom. When I tried to explain this to my family, their reaction was exactly what I should have expected. Mom's first response was complete denial, insisting that the house was the family home and that no legal document could change that fact. She claimed that Dad had intended for her to have lifetime use of the property and that I was misunderstanding the legal technicalities. "That house is where I raised my children," she said during our phone conversation. "It's where your father and I built our life together. Some piece of paper doesn't change the fact that this is my home." Rob's response was more aggressive. He threatened to hire his own lawyer to challenge the will, claiming that there had to be some kind of mistake or fraud involved. He said that it was ridiculous for an 18-year-old to own a house, and that the courts would never support removing an established family from their home based on technicalities. Marcus and Jessica refused to even discuss moving out. They had settled into their expanded living arrangements and couldn't understand why they should have to give up their space for someone who had already chosen to leave. As far as they were concerned, I had abandoned the family, and they weren't going to be punished for my decision. They acted like the deed was just a piece of paper. But while my family was busy denying reality, I was working with Mr. Davidson to establish my legal ownership in ways that couldn't be ignored. We started by transferring all the utilities into my name: electricity, gas, water, internet, and garbage collection. I began paying the property taxes directly, and we updated the homeowner's insurance policy to list me as the primary policyholder. Every month, I received bills for maintaining my house while my family lived there, without permission, and without contributing to any of the costs. The gas bill for their heating, the electricity for Jessica's ring lights, and Marcus's gaming setup. The water for their long showers and daily laundry. I was paying for all of it, while they treated me like an unwelcome visitor who had no right to be involved in their lives. The documentation was building a clear legal trail. Bank records showed that I was the one paying for the house's maintenance and upkeep. Insurance companies had me listed as the property owner. The county tax assessor sent all property-related correspondence directly to me. I started paying all the bills on my house. The complete will documentation revealed just how thoroughly my father had protected my interests and how clearly he had anticipated problems with his remarriage. Mr. Davidson walked me through every clause, and it became obvious that Dad had been very intentional about every decision he'd made regarding the house and my future. The will was extremely specific about the house ownership. The property was left directly to me with the explicit instruction that my mother's guardianship of the trust would terminate automatically when I reached the age of 18. There was no provision for her to continue living in the house after that date, and no language suggesting that Dad intended for her to have permanent residence rights. Most importantly, the will included a section that explicitly excluded any future spouse or stepchildren from having any claim to the property. Dad had written in clear legal language that the house was intended solely for his biological son, and that no marriage or family arrangement that occurred after his death would change that inheritance. Mr. Davidson showed me the specific clause, "I direct that this property shall belong exclusively to my son, and that no individual who becomes part of my wife's life after my death shall have any claim right of residence or legal interest in said property." Dad specifically excluded Rob and his kids. The property ownership evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Every legal document related to the house now had my name on it, and the paper trail clearly established that I was the sole legal owner, with complete authority over the property. The deed transfer had been processed automatically on my 18th birthday, just as Dad's will had specified. The county clerk's office had updated their records to reflect my ownership, and I received official notification that the property title was now in my name only. The assessed value property tax obligations and all legal responsibilities had been transferred to me as the new owner. I had been paying the property taxes for the past 3 months, and the receipts clearly showed that I was the responsible party for all property-related expenses. The county had my name and my grandparents' address on file as the official contact for all property matters. When the annual property tax bill arrived, it was addressed to me as the legal owner. The homeowner's insurance policy had been updated to list me as the primary policyholder. The insurance company required proof of ownership before making the change, which meant they had verified my legal right to the property. All communications about coverage claims and policy changes now came directly to me. Every legal document had my name on it. But what really strengthened my legal position was the communication evidence my family had been creating without realizing it. In their attempts to pressure me into giving up my legal rights, they had documented their own illegal occupation of my property and their refusal to acknowledge my ownership. Mom had left multiple voicemails on my phone where she threatened to never speak to me again if I didn't stop this legal nonsense and let the family live in peace. She explicitly stated that she didn't care what any legal document said because the house was her real home, and I had no right to destroy her family's stability. Rob had sent me text messages that were even more damaging to their case. He wrote that I was trying to steal his family's home, and that he would fight any attempt to remove his kids from their house.
Better.
He claimed that I was being manipulated by my grandparents, and that no court would support removing a family with children from their established home. Marcus had been particularly helpful in documenting their position. He posted on social media about how his greedy stepbrother was trying to kick his family out of their house using technicalities and legal tricks. He shared screenshots of family text conversations where they discussed strategies for dealing with the legal problems I was causing. The most damaging evidence came from witness statements that my grandparents had helped me collect. Neighbors who had known my family for years were willing to testify about conversations they'd had with Mom and Rob, where they had openly discussed how they planned to ignore my inheritance rights because I was just a kid who didn't understand real estate. One neighbor had overheard Rob telling someone at a barbecue that the house belongs to whoever lives in it and pays the bills, and that he wasn't worried about legal documents because possession is 9/10 of the law. Another had witnessed Mom telling a friend that she didn't plan to let some teenager dictate where her family could live. They documented their own illegal activity. Mr. Davidson helped me prepare a formal eviction notice that followed all the legal requirements for removing unauthorized occupants from residential property. Since my family was living in my house without a lease or any legal agreement, they were technically trespassers, and I had every right to have them removed through the court system. The eviction notice gave them 30 days to vacate the property, which was actually more generous than required by law. We could have demanded immediate removal since they had no legal right to be there, but Mr. Davidson recommended following the standard eviction timeline to ensure that everything was done properly and couldn't be challenged later. We coordinated with the sheriff's department to ensure that the eviction would be enforced if my family refused to leave voluntarily. The deputy I spoke with reviewed all of our documentation and confirmed that we had an airtight case. He said that property ownership disputes were usually complicated, but this one was unusually clear-cut. The law was completely on my side. My family's reaction to the eviction notice was exactly the kind of desperate overreach I should have expected. Instead of accepting the legal reality, they launched a full-scale campaign to pressure me into backing down through guilt manipulation and public shaming. The phone calls started immediately. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends began contacting me to express their shock and disappointment about my cruel treatment of my own mother and innocent stepchildren. They had been told that I was trying to make my own family homeless out of spite and greed. Mom had crafted a social media narrative that painted me as a heartless son who was using legal technicalities to destroy his family's stability. Her posts talked about how devastated she was that her own child would turn against his family, and how worried she was about the emotional impact on Marcus and Jessica, who had already been through enough trauma with their own parents' divorce. Rob's relatives were even more aggressive. They started a social media campaign calling me cruel and selfish, sharing posts about how wrong it was to displace children from their established home. Some of them even suggested that I was being manipulated by my grandparents, who supposedly had never liked Mom, and were using me to get revenge. The threats of family estrangement came next. Several relatives told me that if I went through with the eviction, I would be permanently cut off from the family. I would never be welcome at family gatherings, holidays, or special occasions. I would lose all connection to my extended family and would have to live with the knowledge that I had destroyed multiple people's lives for my own selfish purposes. They tried to turn the whole family against me. But while my family was busy trying to manipulate me, I was working with a therapist to prepare myself emotionally for what was coming. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a classic case of family scapegoating, where one person is blamed and punished for problems that are really caused by the family's dysfunction. She helped me recognize that my family's threats and guilt trips were actually confirmation that I was making the right decision. Healthy families don't threaten to cut off members for asserting their legal rights or protecting themselves from exploitation. My grandparents provided constant emotional support throughout the process. They reminded me that my father had anticipated exactly this situation and had structured his will to protect me. They said that Dad would be proud of me for standing up for myself and not allowing others to take advantage of his careful planning. I was ready to lose them to save myself. The morning of the eviction, I arrived at my house with 2 sheriff's deputies, a moving truck, and a folder full of legal documents that would end any wout about who had the right to live there. My family was gathered in the driveway, apparently having some kind of strategy meeting about how to handle what they still thought was just a legal bluff. The look on their faces when they saw the sheriff's cars was worth every sleepless night I'd spent worrying about this confrontation. Mom's confident expression immediately shifted to panic. Rob started walking toward the police cars with the aggressive posture of someone who thought he could intimidate law enforcement. Marcus had his phone out recording everything for what I assumed would be another social media post about his unfair treatment. Deputy Williams stepped forward and addressed my family with the calm authority of someone who had handled thousands of these situations. "We're here to enforce a legal eviction order for this property. The owner has requested that all unauthorized occupants vacate immediately." "There must be some mistake," Mom said, her voice shaky and uncertain. "This is our family home. We've been living here for 2 years. There's no way my son has the legal right to kick us out." That's when I handed the deputy the complete file of documentation, and he began reading the relevant sections aloud for everyone to hear. The whole neighborhood watched them realize the truth. The documentation confrontation was systematic and devastating. Deputy Williams read directly from my father's will, explaining that the house had been left to me in a trust that terminated on my 18th birthday, automatically transferring full ownership to me. He showed them the updated deed with my name as the sole legal owner and the property tax receipts, proving that I had been the one paying to maintain the property. "According to these documents," the deputy said, "your son became the legal owner of this house 3 months ago. You've been living here without the owner's permission, which makes you trespassers. He has the legal right to have you removed." And Mom tried to argue that there had to be some kind of mistake, that Dad would never have intended to leave her homeless, that the documents must be fake or misinterpreted. But every piece of evidence I presented contradicted her claims. I showed them the homeowner's insurance policy with my name as the primary holder. I presented the utility bills that I had been paying for months while they lived there without contributing. I displayed the bank records, showing that I was the one covering all the costs of maintaining my house, while they enjoyed the benefits without permission. Rob's response was to threaten legal action, claiming that I was committing some kind of fraud, and that his lawyer would have the eviction overturned within days. But when Deputy Williams asked to see any legal documents proving their right to live in the house, Rob couldn't produce anything. No lease agreement, no legal contract, no court order, nothing that would give them any legitimate claim to the property. Marcus kept recording everything, apparently still believing that public sympathy would somehow override legal reality. He was narrating for his audience about how unfair it was, that his family was being thrown out of their home by legal technicalities, not understanding that what he was actually documenting was their illegal occupation of someone else's property. Every paper proved they were living in my house illegally. The family reckoning was painful to watch, but necessary for everyone involved. Mom broke down crying, begging me to reconsider, and asking how I could do this to my own family. She kept saying that Dad wouldn't have wanted this, that he would be ashamed of me for making his wife and stepchildren homeless. Dad left me this house for a reason, I said, keeping my voice steady and calm. He wanted me to have security and stability. He put protections in place to make sure that would happen. I'm not taking anything away from you. I'm claiming what was always mine. Rob's threats escalated to the point where Deputy Williams had to step in and warn him about making verbal threats in front of law enforcement. He was furious that his family was being humiliated in front of the neighbors, but seemed unable to understand that the humiliation came from their own refusal to acknowledge legal reality. Marcus and Jessica were in shock, apparently having believed their parents' assurances that this would all get sorted out in their favor. Jessica was crying and asking where they were supposed to live, while Marcus kept insisting that this couldn't be legal because they had lived there for so long. By this point, several relatives had arrived, apparently summoned by frantic phone calls, to come help with the family emergency. But when they saw the police cars, the legal documents, and the moving truck, it became clear that this wasn't a situation they could fix through family pressure or emotional manipulation. The deputy gave my family 48 hours to remove their belongings and vacate the property, explaining that any items left behind after that deadline would be considered abandoned. He handed them official paperwork documenting the eviction and warned them that any attempt to return to the property without permission would result in criminal trespassing charges. This was my house, and they had 2 weeks to get out. My family moved out within the 48-hour deadline, loading their belongings into Rob's pickup truck and a rental trailer in complete silence. They ended up in Rob's small 2-bedroom apartment across town, where Marcus and Jessica had to share a room again, and everyone had to adjust to a much more cramped living situation. I changed the locks on my house that same day and installed a security system to ensure that no one could enter the property without my permission. Mr. Davidson helped me obtain a restraining order after Rob made several threatening phone calls, and the legal protection meant that any attempt to contact or harass me would result in immediate arrest. The sheriff's department kept the eviction paperwork on file, which meant that if my family tried to return to the property, they would be arrested for criminal trespassing. After 2 years of feeling like a guest in my own home, I finally had complete control over who could enter my space. The house was finally mine again. Over the next few months, I began renovating the house to make it truly mine. I repainted the rooms, replaced the furniture that reminded me of painful family memories, and created spaces that reflected my own interests and personality. The room that had been divided between Marcus and me became my bedroom and study area. Jessica's former creative studio became a proper guest room for when my grandparents visited. I enrolled in college classes for the fall semester, using the money I had saved from not having to pay rent to cover tuition and expenses. My relationship with my grandparents grew stronger as we spent time together in the house that Dad had wanted me to have, and I began to understand how much thought and love he had put into protecting my future. I built the life Dad wanted for me. I maintained no contact with Mom Rob or their children. My grandparents occasionally mentioned hearing through relatives that the family was struggling financially without the free housing they had been enjoying. But that information didn't change my decision to keep them out of my life. The few relatives who had tried to guilt me into backing down eventually stopped calling when it became clear that I wasn't going to reverse my decision or apologize for asserting my legal rights. Some family is worth losing to save yourself.